Okay, great. Tim Kelley, thank you so much
Here
for
we
being
are.
with me. I really appreciate you taking this time. So, um, yeah, Tim is someone who I'm super interested to talk to share a conversation with, to ask some questions to, particularly about his work in the area of purpose and national purpose, and really the leadership that's necessary for the emergence of different nations discovering and then implementing their purpose in service of the whole. So Tim is someone who's done really unprecedented, quite extraordinary work there, at least as far as I'm aware. And yeah, just there's a whole gold mine of your experience, which I'd really love us to explore. So before I do that, I will
Let's.
just read. I'll just read a little bit from your bio, Tim, so people get a sense of your background. So Tim Kelley is the founder and visionary leader of the True Purpose Institute. He is an international agent of change and thought leader on new paradigm systems and methods. He works with top leaders in many fields and countries to redesign and evolve society. Tim has trained over 1,000 consultants, therapists, and coaches in his methods. He is the author of True Purpose, the book, and the best-selling co-author of 3 other books. His methodologies have been featured internationally in magazines, newspapers, and on television. Tim's client list includes top leaders and executive teams from such companies as Alibaba, ING, Oracle, Nabisco, and PricewaterhouseCoopers. He has also worked with government ministers and presidential candidates and found the higher purpose of 2 countries. Tim has commanded military organizations, including an amphibious assault craft unit, and is a retired Naval Reserve officer. He holds a bachelor's degree in mathematics from MIT. Great. Thank you, Tim. Okay, so to begin, so I would just love to hear a bit about your experience, your interest, how you got into exploring the idea that nations have a purpose that is possible to discover and then bring online.
Yeah. The idea grew out of me poking around with my own purpose, which at the time I would say was to show people the way, but not only people. And the mission I was working at the time was to create heaven on earth. And if someone's religious, I'm fine if they interpret that in a religious setting, but a religious context, but they don't have to. That term fires the right neurons in just about anybody's brain when they hear it. And the idea is setting the bar very, very, very high about what we humans would be satisfied with in what we call society. So I think of humanity, the people, as hardware, and society as the software. I didn't get into it in the bio, but I worked for many years in Silicon Valley as a software database developer and software database consultant, database software. So if you think of society as software, like an operating system for humanity, then it would need periodic upgrades. And we think about like the switch from monarchies to democracies as a major operating system revision, right? So when I say heaven on earth, I'm saying, well, what's our ideal society, our ideal operating system? What's the best thing that we are capable of conceiving of? And how would we go about implementing that in reality? And a part of why I like to push the bar that high is because the brain has a natural negativity bias. So we tend to look at society and see it in terms of problems or mistakes or features that we don't like, and then argue about how we deal with race or gun control or abortion or borders or immigration or all these other things, and say reasonably, the way we're doing this isn't the best way. Like we're screwing it up in education. We're screwing it up in healthcare. We need to do better. That's a perfectly fine critique. The problem is, as anyone who's done a lot of consciousness work knows, that if you focus on solving a problem, you're not going to achieve the best possible results.
Mm.
You're going to tend to unconsciously reify that problem in some way.
Mm.
And you're just going to sort of tweak around the edges. You might make it better, but you're not going to make it ideal if you start with a problem solution mindset.
Mm.
And so I'm just taking a different tack, was just to say, well, forget about all that stuff. What's the best possible society we are capable of imagining?
Mm.
And let's imagine it together. And if we could agree on what that is, I have no doubt that we could implement it, because humanity has re-architected the planet, not just society, but the planet, according to our own desires, multiple times in different ways. So I have no question about our capability. It's about our ability to agree and to focus and deploy resources. That's the hard part, right?
Mm.
And if you and so I was debating within myself and talking to larger forces, as I'm wont to do, to say, okay, well, how would we actually go about this? And the response I got was, well, you'd have to find the higher purpose of a critical mass of countries as a precondition to having that idealized society. And you'd have to transform business and government and the law and the media and art and science, and the military. Let me see if I can get them all. There were 10.
I remember there were 10 you told me when we last spoke.
Right. I can't always remember them all. There's a whole list. The transformation industry was another. Education was another. And I'm missing one. I did say business, didn't I? I'm missing one. Anyway, you get the idea, right? It's just kind of picking out all the various sectors of society and saying, okay, let's transform that. Let's transform that. Let's transform that. Because people are understandably underwhelmed with business's impact on society and the world.
Mm.
People are understandably underwhelmed with government's impact on society and the world. People are understandably underwhelmed with religion's impact on society and the world. Okay, what would it look like if each one of those things was performing optimally, fulfilling its purpose? Because we unconsciously compare what it's doing to its purpose, even if we don't consciously know what that purpose is.
Mm-hmm.
We can correctly say, well, it's definitely not that. Right? We know enough to know that that's not right.
Yeah.
So if all of that happened and a critical mass of countries, and then I was like, okay, anything else? I said, well, yes, you'd have to deal with climate change and create peace in the Middle East. Okay. Anything else? Tim asks, glutton for punishment that I am. Well, yes, there are a few other things, but that'll keep you busy for a while. Get back with us when you've done that. I was like, okay. Version 1 of my to-do list. So it was out of that conversation that this idea of finding the higher purpose of countries came. I'd sort of thought about it a bit already, because I started out finding the purpose of people, and then finding the purpose of groups of people in workshops, then finding the purpose of companies, small ones and then larger ones. And then it turned out we could use the same methods to find the purpose of an institution, like what's the purpose of business? Or what's the purpose of the law? We actually did projects in both of those areas. You can find the purpose of other things. What's the purpose of disease, right? It doesn't have to be something positive. Apparently everything has a higher purpose, or can. So we had done a bunch of that, and then there came this interesting question, well, what about countries? What happens then? And the idea runs something like this, and I did a TEDx talk about this, John, which you can look up, called Why Countries Behave Like Kids. If you go on YouTube or TED, you can go view that. And the way to think about it is, countries, if you think about them, they operate at about the level of 2-year-olds psychologically. Mine, no, mine, wow, this kind of thing.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, fair enough. But what would a mature country look like? If we grew up and started behaving like mature adults, what would that look like? And the question then is, well, why wouldn't we apply the same criteria that we apply to an individual or an organization, right? Because that's our complaint about companies too, right? That they're just fighting over resources instead of trying to contribute and make something better happen. Okay. That's a fair complaint. So now in conscious capitalism and a lot of these other movements, there's this idea that, well, a company should have a higher purpose. It should operate according to a higher purpose. There's all kind of research that says that the companies that do that are healthier and make more money and live longer and all the same sorts of, just like people.
Mm.
When people have a higher purpose, they're healthier, they live longer, they earn more money, right? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Mm.
Like real research on both of those things. And then my thought was, well, then why wouldn't we apply the exact same best practices that we do with people and organizations to country? Countries are organizations after all. They're just much larger and more complicated organizations
Mm.
and consist of a lot more stuff.
Mm.
But, most countries are just looking out for their interests.
Mm-hmm.
That's 2-year-old.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. So I guess, I mean, first of all, it's interesting to point out that what you're talking about is the transition and maturation in national identity and being and expression that is a kind of collective version of the transition that happens for individuals from living from basically being driven by our own self-interests and our own desires, our own needs, our own ambitions, and where we slowly, or sometimes with the help of crisis more quickly, expand and open ourselves and become more available to the bigger picture,
Right.
and
And it's
start
not that self-interest goes away. It's just we don't
no.
expect 2-year-olds to make donations to nonprofits, right? I mean, it's asking too much of them at that stage.
Yeah, that's
Right.
not what they're up to. Yeah.
But if
Yeah,
an adult who was 35 years old was always like, mine, no mine, meh, 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 like
right.
that, and
Yeah,
never thinking about the impact on other human beings,
yeah,
or on the people in society generally, was only interested in what they wanted and didn't care what the impact was on others,
yeah,
we call that person a narcissist or a sociopath, depending
yeah.
on how bad it is, right? So a lot of it has to do with development and how far along are we. And it takes a lot longer for a company to mature than it does a person, and
Mm,
way longer for a country to mature than it does a company. So I'm not saying that anything's wrong.
mm,
It's just taken this long to get to this point.
mm,
And I think, I could be wrong, but I think we're at the point where it starts to make sense to introduce the idea of a purpose of a country and
yeah.
see which ones are game.
Well, the idea that we're at a point in history where there's um, large scale incentives for transformational upgrade is not a radical one. Like, or, for some people,
To some people, it is.
for some people, yeah, for some people. I think something that I imagine people listening to this would be super curious to hear a bit more about would be the how.
Mhm.
In terms of because you can, yeah, I mean, even I guess for people would be curious around individual purpose discovery, but when you start talking about collective entities, whether we're talking about a business or whether we're talking about an institution, and then when we're talking about a nation, I'd be curious if you could speak a bit more into how does that process of inquiry and discovery and attunement happen, particularly when we're talking about entities like nations that have a lot of people that are a part of them.
Yeah, it makes sense to think about individual purpose first and scale up. It really
Mm-hmm.
helps the brain to be able to track when
Mm-hmm.
you're doing it, because finding the purpose of a country just as a conceptually seems overwhelming.
Right.
Well, how would we do that, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's good to start with the small and scale up to the large. So let me say there's two different factors to consider. One is the how, like as in methods,
Mm-hmm.
because purpose information is difficult to come by, right? If
Mm-hmm.
anyone's ever thought, yeah, I wonder what my life purpose is, usually you don't get an immediate answer when you have that thought, right? You could ask that question of yourself many times and
Yeah.
hear crickets. So how do you go about finding the purpose of something? That's one question. And the other question is, when you're dealing with a company or a country, who's involved, who's in the room when that's happening, is
Yeah.
another very valid question.
Mm-hmm.
So with the methods first, let me say there's, broadly speaking, 3 different types of methods.
Mm-hmm.
One type of method is what we would call spontaneous or accidental. There are people who know their purpose in life and they found it because they've always known, or because they hit their head in a shower one day, or they got in a car crash and had an out-of-body experience, and now they know their purpose, right? They didn't engage in a deliberate process to find it, it just showed up. That's only a couple percent of the population. Most of us, myself included, aren't so lucky. We have to wait and work at it. The second type of method is an inquiry-based method, where let's say I were a coach and you were my client. I give you a list of questions, and you often spend like an hour or two journaling answers to all these questions. And they might be things like, if you had a year to live, what would you do? Or if you won the lottery, what would you do? Or this sort of thing. And so now we get back together, and I look through all your answers, and we find patterns and themes, and then test those patterns and themes and create purpose statements out of them. That's how, when someone actually does a workshop or reads a book or hires a coach, 99% of the time, that's how the purpose process is done. The way I do it, which I alluded to earlier when I talked about talking to larger forces, is I assume that the purpose is unconscious. And if we're going to make it conscious, the simplest, not necessarily the easiest, but the simplest way to do that is to communicate with something that has access to that purpose information already. And what that is going to depend on the person's belief systems. So for most people, it could be some part of them, their purpose part, or their soul, or their spirit, or their inner truth, or their gut, or their intuition, or whatever they want to call it, their heart, that feature of themselves has better access to their purpose than their conscious mind does. So they have a conversation with it, and it explains the purpose to them. Or for those who are inclined towards such things, it could be external, like the universe or God or spirit or their spirit animal or a dead relative or Allah, Buddha, whatever, right? If they think that that thing knows their purpose, then they can talk to it and it could tell the purpose. Now, there's a lot to making this work, but that's the way that I go about it with my clients, both individual and organizational. I prefer the latter method because it provides more purpose information, and the purpose information is usually more accurate and more inspiring. But those methods are trickier to use. There's usually fear and resistance in the way that has to be dealt with and stuff. And then there's the how do you talk to whatever, your soul to ask your purpose and blah, blah, blah. But if you can get that stuff to work, you get lots of really compelling, really precise purpose information out of it, which I prefer to do for individuals and organizations. And when I did do 2 purpose pilot programs with 2 different countries, that's how we went about it. Now let's talk about the who's in the room when you do this. So let's say you were a CEO and I were a consultant, and you had read about B Corps and conscious capitalism and a lot of this kind of stuff, and you were like, Tim, I need to find my company's higher purpose. How do we do that? Well, you and I could go in a room for a day and find the purpose of your company, but that's not the best way to go about it. The reason is that when you come out of that room and go back to your company, you now have a very big sales job to do to get everybody who wasn't in that room to agree that this is the company's purpose and to be willing to do anything about it. Now, in theory, you're the CEO. You should just be able to tell them to do that. But ask any CEO how that goes. It's a nice theory. Right? I remember when I was in the Navy, I used to promote people under me to become like officers and stuff. And they would start giving people orders and the people wouldn't listen and they'd be horrified. And I'd say, yeah, welcome to leadership, buddy. This is how it goes. So it's a lot of work to get the company to adopt the purpose that is true, even though you have the authority. So the better practice is to get a bunch of people in the room finding the purpose with you together, which makes it take longer, but not as much longer as you'd think. Now we're talking, 2 or 3 days instead of 1 day, even if we have dozens and dozens or even hundreds of people in the room. And now all the people who participated in the process are bought in on that purpose. And now you have that many ambassadors and salespeople to go out to the rest of the organization that didn't participate to convince them, instead of you trying to do that by yourself. So the same principle applies, but even more so if we're talking about a country. Let's say you're the president or the prime minister or the king or the dictator. Okay, you have some form of reasonably high level of executive authority to declare a purpose on behalf of the country.
Mm.
Well, when you do that, a bunch of people are going to say, oh, that's cool. Yeah, that's it. A bunch of people are going to say, no way. That's not right. Particularly if you're a politician, the parties that aren't in office have a strong incentive to say that you're wrong and to argue with you about it, right? So we need a process that will result in general agreement that this is the purpose of the country, right? Which means it can't be a solo activity or even 10 people or even 100.
Mm.
So now we get into this stakeholder view of things to say, well, who are the constituencies in this country?
Mm.
And who are the people within those constituencies that other people will listen to, right? So one of the countries we did was Israel.
Mm.
So we made sure to involve Arabs and
Mm.
religious Jews and non-religious left-leaning secular Jews and settlers from the West Bank, right?
Mm.
And this was just a pilot, right? If we were doing it for real, we would have to make sure we had enough Ethiopians and Russians and Moroccans
Mm.
and Sephardic Jews and Ashkenazi Jews, right? And Druze and Christians. There are Christians who've been living in Israel for thousands of years, right? And get all these, make sure that there's representation from all of these groups so that everybody's like 2 degrees of separation away from someone who participated in the process.
Yeah. Yeah.
And now when the answer comes out and someone says, oh, that's a load of crap, that can't be it. The person next to him says, no, no, no. My sister participated in that process and she said that's absolutely it.
Yeah.
And here's why. Oh, okay. That's different than the president or the prime minister or the dictator announcing the purpose. Very different process, right? Now, even then, we're probably only talking about thousands of people participating in a country the size of Israel. If you're doing a statistical survey of Israel and you want a random sample, it's something like 470 people gets you enough to get a statistically valid random sample. We don't need 1 million Israelis to participate, right? So, but it needs to be a public process where everyone can see it happening and there's no surprise. You don't say, by the way, we now have the purpose of the country. It's this. You say, we're going to find the purpose. Now we're finding the purpose. Here's how we're doing it. Here's how it's going. Here's a preliminary result. Here's a final result, so that people see it all the way along the way, right? So I've spent a lot of time thinking about this, a lot of time talking about this, and worked with hundreds of leaders in different countries, both on their own individual purpose and on the purpose of their country. And so this is all very well thought through. And what I'm waiting for is 2 things, and this is to do a full official national purpose project. One is official approval, which I actually have from one country, but I can't say which one. And the other is the right conditions, and conditions includes funding.
Right. Yeah.
Now, the conditions thing is important, and you haven't asked about this, but I'm going to answer this question for you anyway, which is, when is it the right time to find a country's purpose? And the right time is when the country has an incentive to find that purpose. The same is true for people. The same is true for companies, right? It doesn't work to walk up to someone on the street and say, I'm going to find your purpose now, right? They have to have, even if I want to find the purpose, they have to have their own selfish, personal motive for wanting to do it and wanting to do it now.
Yeah.
Now, that could be anything. Maybe they just got divorced and they're thinking, what do I do with myself now? Or maybe I'm a mom and my kid went away to college. Or maybe I just got out of prison. Or maybe I just got diagnosed with a life-threatening disease. Maybe I just got cured from a life-threatening disease. Maybe I just turned 55 and I'm having a midlife crisis. Maybe I'm about to retire, right? There could be any number of reasons why I would want to find my own purpose in life. But if I don't have at least one, it's probably not going to go well. And the answer can be, I think that sounds really cool. That's sufficient motive. And the same would be true for a company. right? Maybe their industry is threatened. That would be a great reason. Maybe they've achieved all their goals and they're looking for a next level thing to do. That would be fine. Maybe the CEO had a dark night of the soul, and this is what happened with Interface, right? And where it's like the CEO realizes he's destroying the environment by
Mm,
making carpets that last for 1,000 years.
mm,
Yikes, what do we do instead? Okay, good. There's a motive, right? Same for a country. What's the motive for this country finding its purpose now?
mm,
In the case of Colombia, which is one of the pilots we did, they had a great motive, which is they just finished decades of internal, not quite civil war between the government and narco terrorists out in the jungle who were like executing politicians and kidnapping rich people and ransoming them back to their families. It was an absolute mess. And with external aid, I didn't think this was going to work, but it did. With military aid, they were able to get the whole thing handled. And now they're like dealing with reconciliation with the terrorists, but it
mm,
raises it's the getting over the life-threatening disease thing,
mm,
which is now what?
mm, mm,
I've been in the hospital for 10 years fighting cancer. Now I'm in remission. I say to my doctor, what do I do now? He says, go home, live your life. And I'm like, but my life has been dealing with cancer for 10 years. I don't know what my life is separate from that. There's a purpose problem. So that was why it was a good time for Colombia at that time.
mm. Awesome. Thank you. That's amazing that you've been doing this work. One question, I've got a few questions that come up. One question that comes up, how do you, what's the essence of how you would bring a collective inquiry like that to a place of coherence? Because, you know, for instance, if you use the example of with Israel, say you have a big room of 400 and what was it, 470 people to have a
Right. Now
representative
you've got
group.
470 candidate purpose statements at
Right,
least.
right, exactly. So then you've
Yep.
got, you know, what is it that supports so that it's not just 470, I think this is it, no, I think this is it, through to a collective sense of coherence, of collective discovery and kind
Yep.
of revelation, even in a certain
Yep.
way.
So when we're training true purpose coaches and consultants, we teach them methods for testing purpose statements for efficacy and accuracy.
Mm,
Efficacy meaning a good purpose statement should produce an emotional reaction of some sort, right? If
mm,
if it's your purpose and you don't feel anything when you say it, it's probably not your purpose.
right.
Right? And the reason for that, by the way, which is very important, is the purpose is intended to motivate a change in behavior.
Yeah, yeah.
So think about it, like if we're a company and we have a higher purpose and it doesn't cause a change in behavior, we failed. It's not doing anything.
Mhm,
So the purpose has to inspire me as an employee or a leader or a
mhm,
customer or an investor in that company to do something different as a result of my knowledge of that purpose.
mhm,
If it's not doing that, it's not doing anything.
mhm, mhm,
Well, how do people behavior change? Well,
mhm,
people make decisions with emotion and justify them with logic.
mhm,
So if I don't feel anything,
mhm,
I'm not going to change my behavior. Now,
mhm,
I'm a profoundly logical person, and it really bothered me when I discovered that this was true. I really didn't like
mhm,
it, but
mhm,
it's absolutely true. In
mhm.
fact, I saw this recently. There was a guy who had brain damage, and they had to like, I don't know if he got shot or hit in the head or something, but they had to cut the thing that connects the emotional response stuff to the cerebral cortex decision making stuff. So he became like a real live Mr. Spock or Commander Data, where his decision making was purely rational. What happened was he couldn't make decisions. You
Interesting.
would think that what would happen is the person would arrive at a logical conclusion, and that's what they do. That's not what happened. His brain would just go in circles because it actually takes the energy of emotion to get the brain to pick a winner from among the various options. And
Mm,
absent the emotion, the brain can't converge on an answer.
mm,
So people make decisions with emotion and justify those decisions retroactively after the fact
mhm,
with logic. and they can
Mm.
see the parts of the brain firing in that sequence. First, the limbic brain fires, the decision gets made, then the cerebral cortex fires to come up with the rationale.
The story that
So
we
the purpose statement has to inspire emotion in
yeah,
order to inspire a change of behavior.
yeah,
No emotion, no change of behavior, because no change in decision-making process.
yeah,
So therefore, we test purpose statements for emotional impact.
yeah,
That's one of the tests. There's like 14 of them that we can use to test efficacy and accuracy of purpose statements, but that's one of the simpler ones.
yeah.
And so we have these 474 people in the room, and we're having them practice doing various tests on the purpose statements. We're not averaging them. Then you get this watered down lowest common denominator thing. We don't even care which ones they like the most.
Yeah.
We care which ones pass these very specific tests. And when we're done, some people love it and some people hate it, but no one's neutral about it. And people lose the ability, when you really get the purpose right, they lose the ability to argue that that's not the purpose. They may say, I hate that purpose, but they don't say, that's definitely not our purpose.
Like there's something
And we've seen
self-evident.
this both with national purposes and organizational ones. Sometimes they're confused by it,
Yeah.
but if they understand it, I mean, often what happens is they say, well, obviously it's that. Why did we pay this guy all this money to find it? Well, because 5 minutes ago you didn't know it was that. That's why you made that money, right? But it's because people have an unconscious relationship to the purpose already, if they're a stakeholder in that entity, whatever it is, whether it's their own purpose, their family, their company, or their country. If they're a participant in that thing,
Mm.
they have an unconscious relationship to its purpose already.
Mm-hmm.
And when that purpose becomes revealed, a pretty high percentage of them just know that it's right and go, oh, yeah, it's that. They may not be happy about it, but they know it's true.
Mm. Mm. That's super helpful. Thank you. So there's a process of refinement and sensing that allows the whole collective to tune in deeper and deeper into and essentially until it becomes self-evident.
That's right. And we were curious to see, because people told us, well, you can't do this in Israel, Tim. It's not going to work here. We're so polarized and so divided. There's no way.
Yeah.
So we did it like, I don't know, 16 times or something with different groups of leaders. And one time we deliberately, sometimes it was a particular organization, so they all kind of knew each other. So it wasn't very divisive. But interestingly, the purpose statement still looked like the other groups. It was a theme.
Mm.
But one time we made sure to include as much variety as we could manage. Like we had West Bank settlers, Tel Aviv leftist secular people, rabbis, Orthodox, Arabs, all in the room at the same time working on the purpose statement together, and it worked exactly the same. One day, all converged to a set of purpose statements at the end. No debate. This is definitely
Mm.
it.
Amazing. Awesome. Okay. So I'm curious then about this piece that you mentioned about then there needs to be incentive, and that then for a nation to be at a point where there's sensed incentive to uncover this, to reveal it. And I'm curious about how you see kind of where we are. If you take a scan of the world
We
as
who? You mean the world?
yeah, yeah. If you if
Okay.
you if you look out over the world right now, and we
Mhm.
take into consideration some of the major issues that are playing out, from international wars through to climate change, through to
Yep.
economic imbalance that is kind of very wobbly, it seems, quite
Yeah.
regularly. These essentially large scale, very interconnected issues that are impacting globally. I'm
Right.
wondering.
So the
Yeah,
security concerns and the economic concerns are
yeah,
constantly doing this for
right,
everybody.
yeah,
Right. And some of them are global, some of them, like right now, inflation's high everywhere. We get complaints here in the US trying to blame our leaders for it. It's like, inflation's high ever. It's lower here than it is for us,
Right.
But so something like that can impact everybody, or you can have a regional thing. A particular country can have hyperinflation or something like that. Same thing with security stuff, right? If you're Taiwan, or worse, Ukraine,
Yeah.
right? Or you're Syria, right? There's real, or Afghanistan. There's serious either external, internal security stuff, or both
Mm.
going on,
Mm.
right? Now, crisis is a great motivator, but it's
Mm.
also a great distractor.
Mm. Mm.
And so, for one individual organization or country, a crisis might be the make it the perfect time to find their purpose,
Mm.
while for another it might make it the worst time.
Mm.
And the question is, it's a psychological question of how do I respond to the crisis? So let's say that you and I were both getting divorced from our spouses.
Mm.
And you wake up in the middle of the night every night thinking, why is this happening to me? This isn't how I imagined my life turning out. What does the future hold if not this? I'm very deeply confused.
Mm.
Honestly, I'm not even sure who I am as a single man anymore. I've been married for N years and da 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 da. Da. This is really, really messing me up. I'm grieving this. I'm dealing with other legal and financial issues, but there's deeper questions getting profoundly stimulated
Mm.
by this. That's your experience. My experience is I hate her. I can't believe she's doing this to me. I'm lawyering her up. I'm going to make sure that she doesn't get control of these kids,
Yeah.
and make sure she doesn't get a penny.
Mm.
And that's my point of view about my divorce.
Right.
Well, obviously, you're a great candidate for personal purpose work in this situation, and I am a terrible candidate for
Mm.
purpose work. I'm going to be completely distracted arguing with lawyers and accountants and judges and have no time for purpose work.
Mm.
Whereas for you, it's suddenly become a much higher priority than it was before,
Mm.
right?
Mm.
Same thing if a loved one dies,
Mm.
or if I get fired from my job, right?
Mm.
And it can be both, right? You can have real present economic survival concerns and purpose stuff going on at the same time. We're not exclusive about our Maslow's hierarchy needs, right?
Mm.
They happen at the same time.
Mhm.
And we can, in fact, pay attention to and try to meet two different sets of needs at the same time. We're constantly juggling and balancing different needs, right? So the same would be true of a country. So one of the reasons why I keep focusing on Israel, there's a couple reasons. One is they're constantly dealing with existential issues. They use that term in the news all the time. Well, okay. We're not just talking about existential threats. There's a deeper issue of who are we, right? They're concerned about their legitimacy and their right to occupy that land and how much of it.
Mm.
And they assert very strongly we belong here, da 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 da. And there's a lot of pushback and a lot of back and forth and some self-questioning within the country as well. So that all of that raises a who are we and why are we here question.
Mm.
The other reason that's kind of cool is Israel already has two purpose statements, the only country I know of that does.
Mm.
And they're very old.
Mm.
Um, one is Or LaGoyim, which is a light they say light to the nations, but it literally means light to the non-Jews. And the other is Tikkun Olam, which means to fix the world. And
Mm.
those are both very high quality purpose statements and both thousands of years old and still generate reactions in Israelis today.
Mm. Mm.
So it's really a purpose update for them.
Mhm.
But I'm unaware. I mean, the US sort of had a purpose,
Mm.
and it grew out of our divorcing from monarchy and
Mm.
trying to this experiment, which took several tries before we got the Constitution, um, to create a kingless and nobility-less successful nation,
Mm.
which then was something we tried to export. We wanted democracy to spread. And even as late as the 1940s and 1950s, the US had an implied purpose of trying to spread good values and good governance around the world. Now,
Mm.
since then, we've lost it.
Mm.
And part of the reason we lost it was because we were largely successful, right? There are very few actual functioning monarchies where the monarch is actually in control.
Mm.
in the world anymore.
Mm.
There's lots of constitutional monarchies, but that's sort of the democracy operating system overwriting the monarchy operating system without removing all the legacy code, right?
Mm.
So we were largely successful and now need something completely different.
Mm.
But now's not a good time for the US. Why? We're busy tearing ourselves apart politically.
Mm.
Once this current drama dies down, would be a great time to do the purpose of the United States. To say,
Mm.
okay, now that we're done with all this wild wackiness,
Mm.
and assuming we don't revert to an autocracy and there's not a successful coup or anything like that, and we're still a democracy when it's done, okay, we got to figure out what we're doing here. That
Mhm.
would be a great time to do national purpose work for the US.
Mhm. Yeah, fascinating. Thank you. Do you see any other nations that feel like they are on the edge of this, feel like they are starting to, they're there or thereabouts where this is
Yep.
kind of
Yep.
becoming really relevant?
I'm in touch with some people who are plugged into all the leadership class in Slovakia.
Mm.
Um, and it's interesting. The issue they've been having is that the neo-Nazis there have won enough votes to get seats in parliament.
Right.
And even not the neo-Nazis, but just some of the parties that are out of power are going sort of full Trump, if you will,
Yeah.
and creating a lot of drama there. And so there's a possibility there,
Mm.
just because of the degree of political destabilization.
Mm. Mm.
That's one. The
Mm.
other one that's becoming more interesting to me, for practice, among other things, because we haven't actually done an official national purpose project yet. Oh, by the way, Iceland's another good one. They
Mm.
had a whole kind of national meltdown some
Yeah.
while ago where the whole country went bankrupt, and
Mm.
they're another candidate. But there's also the possibility of doing regional purposes for entities that aren't exactly nation states.
Right.
And
Yeah.
examples of that would be Scotland,
Yeah.
Catalonia,
Yeah.
and Kashmir,
Right.
all of which have their own national identity,
Yeah.
but aren't technically countries in the full sense.
Yeah.
And, at least in the case of Catalonia and Scotland, there's a perennial debate about whether they should be.
Mm.
And I actually think that impulse to want to be a separate country is actually an impulse for identity,
Mm.
not an impulse for, and also agency, right?
Yeah.
Decision-making authority over one's own future. But
Mm.
it's not necessary to divorce the parent entity
Mm.
in order to have a sense of national identity and agency.
Mhm.
And there can be, in both cases, there could be a tremendous cost
Mm.
in a large variety of ways to try to do that divorce in
Mm.
much the way that happened with Brexit
Yeah.
and the EU,
I was just
but on
thinking.
a much worse local scale.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and in some cases, like in Catalonia, there's been real violence about it, and or the Basques, the Basque region would be another good example of that. So I think that some of those kind of regional problems could be solved with regional purposes that solve the need for identity
Mm.
without creating conflict with the parent entity.
Mm.
And if those regional purposes were respected and
Mm.
people were able to fulfill and feel motivated by those regional purposes, that would decrease the need to do those expensive and potentially violent divorces.
Mm.
Not guaranteed.
Yeah.
It's
No, I get it.
also possible that a regional purpose like that could lead to a non-violent divorce process that would be far less costly. That could be
Yeah.
another possibility.
Yeah. And then wouldn't be a kind of reactive get away from
Exactly.
the, move, but
Right. The
actually, yeah.
not that impulse tends to lead to, let's say, less than optimal decision making.
Yeah. Yeah. For all of us. Yeah. Um, yeah. And so then this piece around what do you sense is the leadership that's necessary in order to, yeah, to raise this topic within nations, but not just to raise it, but then even to, yeah, for it to become implemented, for it to become actually
Right.
part of the living and breathing
Yep.
ecosystem of how our country's functioning.
Yep. And let me say this, I want to give two answers to that question. One is the answer within the current paradigm.
Right.
What kind of leadership could we reasonably aspire to see happen realistically within the next year or two
Yeah.
that could result in something like this actually happening and having a positive impact?
Mm.
That's one. And then the other is longer term, what kind of leadership would we want to see in these purpose driven nations,
Mm.
which you or I might think of as a new paradigm of national or governmental leadership? What would we want to see in those leaders, which is a higher bar and will take longer to achieve?
Right.
But the act of finding and implementing the purpose could help incent, motivate, generate that later form of leadership that I think people desperately want,
Yeah.
but don't know how to define and don't know where to find.
Yeah.
Um, so, in terms of what it takes to do an official national purpose project, um, there's because of the general political polarization that's going on a lot of places. I wouldn't say everywhere, but a lot of places.
Yeah.
I don't see a lot of political polarization in, say, China or Singapore, but most places there's a lot of, France, Italy, United States, Slovakia,
Mm.
etc. We see a lot of this kind of um, in that environment. There's fewer candidates to be the sponsor of such a project,
Mm.
because if party A says let's find our nation's purpose, party B is automatically going to say, "No, you're wrong." um, so the whole thing has to be proposed by someone who's seen as a fair player by the parties. And
Mm.
usually there's a short list of who that is. And that could be a person, it could be a government agency, it could be a non-government agency. But it would have to be someone where people said, oh, well, if she or he or they want to do it, it's at least worth looking at. Right.
People or entities with bipartisan legitimacy, essentially.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. And there's just not a lot of those.
Mm.
And both the nation and that person or agency has to have incentive for wanting to do so, and they are not necessarily the same incentive,
Yeah.
right? So let's say in parliamentary systems, usually there's either a monarch or a president who's not part of the political fray. Not
Mm.
always, usually.
Mm.
And that person is expected to play referee
Mm.
and not get sucked into the polarized stuff. They're not always successful at it, but that's the idea, right? That we need someone to play referee who's not actually in the game,
Mm.
right? We can't have the umpire or the referee in the sports game betting on the teams. And usually that person would be a natural candidate for that.
Yeah.
And if the timing is right and there's good national incentive and that person or agency has their own personal incentive for wanting to do it, they could say, well, you know what, folks, I think now is a good time to find our national purpose, and here's why.
Yeah.
And that would then spur a debate, but the debate would be framed within well, that's a reasonable position that I either agree or disagree with for the following reasons,
Yeah.
right?
Mm.
As opposed to, what the hell are you talking about? That we would ideally not want that as the response, right? And so now a debate ensues and stuff, and assuming that there's enough political will and
Mm.
funding,
Mm.
then whoever it is who proposed that can proceed with it.
Mm.
And not 100% of people need to agree. When do 100% of people ever agree on anything, right? But if 65% of the population and most of the political parties agree that, yeah, that's probably a good idea, we're good,
Mm.
right?
Mm.
And now you do this stakeholder-based process where you're giving lots of organizations and individuals the opportunity to contribute to and participate in the process in various ways, and to watch the sausage being made, right? To see the thing playing out so that they understand it's not some secret trick being pulled on them. The world is full of conspiracy theories. And now they get to see the sausage come out the other end. It's like, okay, if I care enough, I can watch and see it happening and understand why that's the answer. Right?
Mm-hmm.
So who are those political arbiters who can declare such a thing
Mm-hmm.
and both have people not immediately violently disagree, and also that person or group has to have enough perceived authority and legitimacy that an answer that resulted from the process they advocated for would be seen as official,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because you and I could decide to go find the purpose of a country. No one's going to care, right?
Mm-hmm.
It needs to be someone where their opinion has enough weight
Mm-hmm.
that if they decide to do it, that means it's happening.
Mm-hmm.
Or that enough people would have to oppose them to stop it from happening, but
Mm-hmm.
enough people don't oppose.
Mm-hmm.
Does that all make sense?
Yeah, it totally makes sense. And I mean, essentially, it's demanding the emergence of non-polarized leaders, which
Well, they
is,
exist. They're
yeah,
there.
yeah,
They're often not as visible as the polarized ones,
right.
because the polarized ones make more noise.
Yeah, yeah.
But there are people like in the U.S. on the right and on the left, who the people on the other side are kind of like, okay, if she says so, or if he says so, Yeah. So my son and I, we tend to vote more left, and we're watching like John Kasich, who's this Republican guy, um, but he's a pretty reasonable dude. I don't agree with all his policies, but he's not some wingnut. It's like if he said, "Well, we should really do blah blah blah," I'm not going to automatically disagree with him, right? So in any system, those people usually exist. They're not the most noticeable ones.
Mm-hmm.
In Israel, the one I keep returning to, it would be great if Bougie Herzog, who's the president of Israel, announced that he wanted to find the country's purpose. Why? Well, when he got elected, a whole bunch of he was running against a woman who's an Orthodox Jew, and he got more votes from the Orthodox Jews than she did,
Mm-hmm.
even though he was the head of a political party on the left.
Mm-hmm.
And he's generally seen as a fair guy.
Yeah. Okay.
Right? He's not always, and people have their various complaints about him, of course, but they don't complain that he's evil and secretly trying to do this or that or the other thing. He's seen as a fair guy and truthful, right? It's like, okay, that's it. In an extremely polarized country, there's one person right there who could declare such a thing and people would play along if the timing were right and there were funding.
I'm loving this. And just the last question that I want to ask you before we close, impact. So as you're
Well, I
sharing.
have a second question I told you I'd answer, which is what does the
Okay, yeah,
leadership
go
look
for it.
like in the future?
Oh, please, I would love to hear that.
Right. So this is just the minimum we need to play at all.
Yeah.
Let's imagine that we spent the next 20 years finding the higher purpose of countries.
Yeah.
And then so after the purpose gets found, part of the criteria for success is the politicians start to argue about how to manifest that purpose and who's better qualified to manifest it.
Awesome.
If that happens, we've won.
We've won.
Notice I said argue, right?
Right.
That's fine to have political party A say, no, we should manifest the purpose like this. And party B say, no, you're crazy, you're insane. That's not how to do it. We should manifest it like this. Yeah. And politician A say, well, I'm the best qualified to manifest that purpose because of this. And the other one says, no, not that. I'm better qualified. That is victory. Yeah. Now, let's say we play that game for about 20 years, where the politicians are all arguing about how to manifest the purpose and debating, and we're voting for them, ideally based on which ones we think are most qualified to manifest the purpose. Wouldn't that be nice, right? And now we've been at that for a while. What kind of leadership are we going to want then? What do we want in our leaders? Well, this is something you talk about that I want to underline, which is the stakeholder-based view of the world. How do I aggregate, integrate, and seek to meet the needs of various diverse stakeholder groups that have very little in common with one another, and try to juggle and balance all of that at the same time, as opposed to what we do in the current win-lose paradigm, which is take sides. If party A gets elected, this stakeholder group gets preference and this one gets screwed. If stakeholder B gets elected, this stakeholder gets preference and this group gets screwed. Now, how do we balance the needs of all the stakeholder groups, including the stakeholder groups that some of the stakeholders hate?
Mm-hmm.
So that's number one. Number two is it takes a certain type of person to be able to focus on a purpose long term. It takes long-term thinking. I have to be able to look at something way out in the future and make a decision right now, factoring that long way future thing into this decision right here. Not everyone can do that. A lot of people, when there's a lot of stuff going on, they get blinders on and they're saying, well, the pat's gonna have to wait. I'm just gonna focus on this. Well, there's always another drama. There's always another crisis. There's always something more urgent than the purpose. So if I focus on the more urgent stuff and postpone the purpose, I will never get to the purpose. The other thing, and there's a myth about leaders that we should have leaders who don't have power drives, who don't have egos, who don't require attention. False. The reason that is false is because no one who doesn't have power drives, who doesn't have an ego, who doesn't desire attention, would be willing to do what it takes to learn how to use power on a large scale. Nor would they be willing to subject themselves to the gauntlet of horrifying treatment that we lavish upon our leaders. So it's completely unrealistic to expect someone who doesn't have those, just like it would be unrealistic to expect someone who doesn't like attention to become an actor or a public speaker. That's not how that works. What we do need is leaders with healthy egos who go about meeting their ego needs in healthy and transparent ways. If a leader is doing a good job, that leader deserves attention and praise. And if they like it, great. Now they'll do a better job. It's not something we need to scrub out of the system. It's a feature, not a bug. The bug is when the leader goes about meeting their needs in a way that harms others. We're all selfish, but we vary in our willingness to have a negative impact on other people while meeting our own needs. If your concern about harming others is extremely low, then we call you a narcissist or a sociopath or a psychopath, depending on how bad it is. But we all are focused on meeting our own needs in some way, shape, or form, or we wouldn't survive more than a few days, right? Avoiding getting run over by buses, eating food, not getting in car crashes. These are all self-interested behaviors that hopefully we all engage in. Bathing, right? Sleeping. So we're all doing it all the time. The question is, how much consciousness do we have and how much self-restraint do we have when the act of meeting those needs would cause harm to others? And the way our system is currently designed with these steep, tall hierarchies is we're actually selecting for people who have less concern about their impact on others at the top of corporations and the top of governments, which is a bad idea to give most of the power to the people who have the least concern about how much their impact they're having on others. That's a systemic correction we need to make that goes beyond the scope of our call today.
Yeah, I thank you so much. And I think I'm just, in closing, I'm tuning into the impact piece. I'm tuning into what it would be like to be a citizen within a nation where there had been a collective, coherent enough process that had revealed a national purpose that people feel immediately energized by, where there's a sense of self-evident reality,
a sense of national destiny,
a national destiny, right? A sense of national destiny, and just the organizing power of that to
And if you add the stakeholder-based piece, then that means that the nation is interested in an ongoing way, in your opinion, on how best to manifest that purpose.
Right. And the way that that would then flow through society, the way that that would then flow through the different sectors of society, the other 9, that you mentioned.
Right. And one of the concerns people on the left have is they think that you'll hear this thing of countries are bad, we have to get rid of countries, right? One big happy globe. Like, well, Yes and no. Being able to organize and administrate things on a country scale actually makes a lot of sense logistically.
Yeah.
And something like national pride, if it's expressed as we're doing a better job of creating a better world than the country on the left and right of us are,
Yeah.
that's relatively healthy
Yeah.
compared to national pride where we're going to conquer you and take these territories away from you kind of
Mhm.
national pride,
Mhm.
right? Or we're bigger and badder than you and so we can beat you on the battlefield national pride. That has all sorts of negative impact. But the
Mhm.
national pride itself isn't necessarily a problem depending on the behavior it motivates and how it expresses.
Right. Yeah. 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 For me, this really speaks into the healthy middle between kind of nationalism and globalization, which is such a major tension in the world
Got
today.
to be both, right? Yes, and
Right.
transcend and include.
Absolutely. Tim, thank you so much for sharing your perspectives, your experience. This, for me, this feels critical. It's critical to the world that we want to build. I am right there with you in the work towards manifesting heaven on earth. I feel this is a really critical piece of singularities work going forward. And yeah, we will only learn from this. And I really look forward to further dialogue with you around this whole topic.
I'm delighted. And if you or any of the listeners know a country that's ready to find its purpose and can give me the prime minister, president, monarch, or dictator's phone number, I'd be delighted.
Cool. Well, get in touch with us if that's you. Thank you, Tim.